What's up, everybody? This is Alex Christoforou with the Duran, and I have with me Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. And today we're going to be taking a look at protests in France. All right, Alexander, is Macron's time up?
Well, if you'd asked me that question a few days ago or a week ago, I would have said probably not, because it is so difficult to remove a French president. In fact, I'm not even sure how the thing is possible. But if you are now looking at the situation in France, the protests are growing. They are massively supported. About 80% of the people of France, according to opinion polls, are supporting these protests. Macron's response to them has been so arrogant and incompetent and aggressive that I'm beginning to wonder that we might actually be reaching some kind of tipping point. And I just wonder how this situation can be sustained. And maybe, given that Macron's popularity is plunging, I mean, it is falling week by week, I wonder whether at some point elements in the French establishment are going to say Macron must go, because otherwise the situation is going to get out of control completely, and we could be facing a really dangerous situation like a general strike, attempts to take over buildings, all that sort of thing. Now, it's important to stress France is a country with a tradition of revolution. One shouldn't just think of the French Revolution of 1789. There have been other ones. In French history, there were big protests, as we all know, as recently as 1968. But if you go back in time, perhaps a more interesting comparison would be the crisis that happened in France in 1958, which brought Charles de Gaulle to power, in which the old political system, the Fourth Republic, disintegrated, and de Gaulle, who had been waiting in the wings, took over through a process that was extraordinarily complicated, but was basically fought out not in Parliament, but in the streets.
Macron should have never been president of France.
Absolutely.
In my opinion. No. He should have never been there. And I think he's starting to show that he is not meant to lead France.
Yep.
Describe a little bit, Alexander, as to Macron's response to the protests, which show a true lack of leadership, accountability, responsibility, you name it.
Right, let's first of all just comment on the first point you made. You are absolutely right. He should never have become president of France. He wasn't wanted by the majority of the French people. He became president as a result of a deeply manipulated and rigged process to prevent François Fillon, who was the candidate that was overwhelmingly supported by the French people, and to prevent Fillon becoming president of France. Now, Fillon is an establishment figure, a conservative figure, but he did promise a type of change that was not acceptable to the French political establishment, because they didn't trust Fillon. They saw him as too close to Russia, too hostile to the EU, and so they manipulated the electoral system and various allegations of corruption to bring in Macron instead. The result is we have a French president who combines extreme personal arrogance with a lack of popular legitimacy, an explosive situation. And coming back to this response, what Macron has done is that he has raised these taxes on diesel fuel. In France, in rural France, people rely a lot on their cars to do their work, to travel to work. It is an essential element of life in the French countryside. The French people, like the people all over Europe, had been pressed into buying diesel cars on the assumption that diesel cars gave out fewer carbon emissions, and that this was somehow good for the environment. And so they were actually persuaded by the French government and by European governments and by the EU to buy diesel cars. Now Macron has absolutely arbitrarily decided that diesel fuels are somehow dangerous to the environment. He's hiking up taxes on them without providing any real cushion to poorer French people who were, as I said, induced into buying diesel cars. And he's doing this on top of a succession of other changes, cutting taxes on wealthy people, giving tax breaks to businesses, which is seen by many people in France as benefiting the French equivalent of the 1%. And at the same time, he is responding to these protests in the most extraordinarily arrogant way. He is talking about protesters being essentially thugs. That's actually words he has used. He has said that he won't back down at them. He's talking wildly about establishing a state of emergency across France, which can only aggravate the protests even further. And, of course, at the same time as he does all these things, he talks about things that most French people are not in the slightest bit supportive of, like establishing EU armies, about nationalism being somehow a bad thing in a country, France, which is very nationalist. So he is going out of his way to provoke his people at a time when, as I said, he lacks that fundamental legitimacy that comes with having won an election in a straightforward and honest way.
Well, I mean, in essence, Alexander Macron is just doing what he was placed by the elitist powers to do. I mean, he is following the neoliberal globalist agenda, is he not?
Exactly. And of course, at a time when the neoliberal agenda is becoming increasingly discredited. That was an extraordinarily foolish thing to do. Can I say something? I mean, this is a good example of why manipulating elections is such a bad thing. Because Fillon, I come back to what I said about him. He was an establishment figure. He would have changed certain things in France, but he would not have been a revolutionary undermining the whole system, the whole establishment system that exists there, by preventing him becoming president, by bringing in this vain, inexperienced and arrogant man and making him president. We are now seeing that the French establishment is itself creating conditions which could lead either to a social breakdown or even to a revolution.
What do you make of Macron placing the blame on these protests, especially in the beginning, on far right, on Le Pen? I mean, he even blamed it on Russia for a time. What do you make of those
I mean, this is exactly, by the way, the same technique he used during the election, which was to basically say that any sort of criticisms of him that were appearing anywhere originated with Russia. He banned RT and Sputnik during the election campaign from his press conferences. He actively promoted the suggestions that there was a sort of Russian disinformation campaign against him, for which no evidence, by the way, was ever produced. So he's playing the old copybook. And of course he won the election by running against the pseudo-fascist bogey spectre of Marine Le Pen. May I say again, I've said this scores and scores of times. Whatever you think of Marine Le Pen, she is not a fascist. She is a traditional French Gaullist. If you examine her policies, those are the policies she has. The same sort of policies that General de Gaulle used to have. But Macron talks about her as being this far-right, neo-fascist person, this bogey figure. That was what he ran against in the election. That was how he got himself elected during the election. And he's playing all that old, discredited record all over again.
And people are not buying it. Obviously, I think the latest polls show that over 80% of the French population is actually in favor of the protesters, and are in favor. They're siding with them.
Well, absolutely.
And those polls, that's pretty high.
It's overwhelming. Even Macron's supporters are starting to pick up on this. There was an article in The Guardian today, the great British newspaper that supported Macron, that supports the same sort of policies in Britain. And its reporter was saying that he has never seen anger and hatred in France towards the establishment of the kind he's seeing now. And the reason that is happening is because the establishment greatly overplayed its hand with Macron. They've, as I said, installed a person who, I repeat again, combines extreme arrogance with a profound lack of legitimacy. And by his arrogance, he is provoking the French nation into a situation where they are moving further towards a fundamental, almost revolutionary change than would have been the case if that election a year and a half ago had been allowed to happen properly.
All right, so what's next now for Macron, Alexander? On the one case, if he cracks down on the protesters, he's doomed. If he lets the protests continue as is, he's doomed. How does he get out of this box?
Well, first of all, we have to qualify this, because I'm not absolutely sure that he is doomed yet, in the sense I'm not sure that things have reached that critical mass yet, when he's going to face general strikes, mass protests, buildings being occupied, railways and roads being blockaded, the kind of things that can happen in France, which would create such an atmosphere of crisis that he would have to go. So I'm not sure we're at that tipping point yet. But we could be. And as I said before, the nature of the French Constitution, the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, makes it very unclear what does happen in a situation like that. Macron doesn't seem to me like the kind of person who will go quietly, but I suspect that there would be. Though there are always procedures in France, instruments in France, which can say to him, look, you cannot continue like this, you must go. And then we would see some kind of provisional government presumably taking over. Difficult to know who would lead it, but it could be Marine Le Pen, it could be Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the leader of the left, though he's a moody and strange and personality, and perhaps not one who has really the support of the people who are protesting at the moment. Or maybe it could be a combination of all of these people. But we are entering into uncharted waters. The only thing I would say is that this is not, as I said, unique for France. France has a tradition of uprisings, of governments, of arrogant leaders falling, and of things being worked out afterwards, and of people coming together, political leaders coming together, the ones that are not discredited, that is, and finding a kind of solution for France that leads forward and renews France in all sorts of ways.
If these protests were happening in, say, I don't know, Russia, what do you think the press reaction would be? Because it seems to me that Macron is getting a lot of cover from the mainstream media.
Well, already, in fact, there are comments about this, and people are saying, well, look, when protesters were going around in Ukraine and protesting against Viktor Yanukovych's government and behaving far more violently than the protesters are in France, and there were far fewer of them, by the way, than there are in France, what did the media do in those days? They hugely supported them. They backed them, because those protesters were pro-EU, pro-West, anti-Russian. Now this time, of course, the protesters are seen as threatening a neoliberal, globalist idol, that is to say Macron. So we see that there is great opposition to them, great hostility to them in the media, and the media is basically trying to downplay the significance of this event and is clearly hostile to the protesters and backing Macron. But of course, I come back to what I said. If this thing reaches the tipping point and we start seeing buildings being occupied in Paris, then, as I said, and the kind of things I was saying, roads blockaded, railways blockaded, workers coming out on strike across France, even the police coming out on strike, there is talk of this. Then, as I said, we would be in a revolutionary situation. Revolutions happen in France. It is the country that has, if you like, the intellectual property rights in revolutions. And the French have a tradition for this sort of thing and a knowledge of how to take it. And as I said, once the discredited leader is driven out, then a new leader takes over. Perhaps it would be Marine Le Pen. It's difficult to see who else it would be. And then France takes a new direction.
How will we know, finally, Alexander, how will we know if it does hit that tipping point? What are going to be the signals or sign? Is there one? Are there many?
Right. It depends on many things. I mean, I know this sounds a strange thing to say about a European country, but one institution always to look at is the army, because of course if there's a state of emergency and that kind of crisis, and Macron declares a state of emergency, then the thing he would probably want to do is call in the army to regain control. And if the military refuses, then he's finished at that stage. And the army has that role. The police is the other organization to look at. But ultimately, it is the politicians. And always the parliamentary chamber, the National Assembly, is the key institution. Now, Macron's party has a huge majority in the National Assembly, but it is a very amorphous majority of all kinds of people cobbled together, perhaps not really representing anybody very much. And it's very easy to see how out of that, a few people, and Marine Le Pen, has her representatives there, as the Jean-Luc Mélenchon, but Marine Le Pen especially. One can see them mobilizing through the National Assembly and also through the regional parliaments and the mayoralties, the various mayors that exist in various parts of France, and these coming together and saying to Macron, you've lost the confidence of the French people. The time has come for you to go, and perhaps some kind of constituent assembly or something like that being put together and a new government being formed through it.
Well, let's see. Macron is. I think none of this should come as any surprise, if you asked me. I mean, like we said earlier, I just think Macron is doing what he was put in the office to do, which is look after the globalist agenda.
Exactly. At a time when, as I said, the tide is running out on it. I mean, it was a totally misconceived thing. I mean, the people who engineered it in France just weren't looking at the world as it was changing. And can I just say something about this? France, of course, is one of the great bellwethers in Europe. It is, in some ways, the most important one. Where France goes, Europe follows. If this thing reaches tipping point in France, and France changes, and Marine Le Pen forms a provisional government, or Mélenchon. I mean, Mélenchon, and one mustn't be confused about this. The fact that Mélenchon is supposedly left and Marine Le Pen is right. If you actually look at most of what their programs, their respective programs are, they agree on many things. But whichever one of them it is, and it almost certainly would be Marine Le Pen at this point. I mean, if there is that kind of revolution in France, you can say goodbye to the EU. That's the first thing. I mean, it would be unworkable in that case. Without France, it would be unworkable anyway. But if we have a revolutionary government like that in France, or an insurrectionary government like that in France, then that whole structure collapses. And we don't have to talk any longer about Italy, about Hungary, because France carries so much more weight than all of these.
Yes, it does. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below and click on the notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video, and visit the Duran shop. Pick up a t-shirt, help support the Duran. For this month in December, we also have a 20% discount on all our merchandise. So buy something now for the Christmas holidays. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you once again. Until next time, take care.